So it's the end of 2023 and that can mean only one thing. It's time to review the Trachycarpus growing in my garden. So you may remember I planted out one of every species along my fence or further down the garden, and we've watched them grow over the years. So they've had basically 10 years or 10 growth seasons in the garden, growing from very small plants to the plants we have behind me. And in this video we'll go through them one by one, see what they look like now, and you can look back at the previous videos and see how they've grown, or not really grown much, over the last 9 or 10 years. So join me as we take a tour of Trachycarpus in the garden. So here's the Trachycarpus wagnerianus, and it's grown into a beautiful palm. It's well over 2 meters tall now. Lots and lots of nice deep green leaves, and it's grown steadily this year. So it's pushed out probably about 6 or 7 leaves at the top there, and it's still kept all the lower leaves right down to ground level, apart from the few that I've taken off for space reasons. And it's looking good. It's got the nice shaggy trunk, nice and robust. Doesn't matter what the weather is, it always looks good. Wind resistant leaves, very hardy, probably one of the best palms for the garden. So that is the Trachycarpus wagnerianus. Now next we have the Trachycarpus martianus, and that took a battering last winter where it completely defoliated, and with the -6 we've already had this winter, it's not looking great. And it did have lots of branches over it, so it squashed some of the leaves down here, and some have drooped down with the weight of the bag that I put over it. I put a bit of a duvet over it and it's weighed it down a bit. Did that after the -6 rather than before, just in case we've got any cold temperatures, but thankfully we haven't so far. But it has produced a nice stout trunk, which is just behind that leaf there. So the trunk is about 60 centimeters tall, and it has regained all the leaves. It's grown 4.5 leaves this year. It'll probably lose them again over this winter. Hopefully it'll come back strong in 2024. So that's the Trachycarpus martianus. Next to the martianus is the Trachycarpus takil, and this has quite long, elegant leaves, very thinly divided leaves, quite floppy as well at this stage. And this hasn't really grown much of a trunk. So we'll come down, have a look. You can see the trunk there. That is only about 30 centimeters at most tall. Very slender, very thin, tapering trunk. It's been growing at an angle for a few years now, sort of creeping along the ground before going up. And that is a true takil. And that is pretty slow growing, so it's only grown about 2 or 3 big leaves this year. So slow but steady. Hopefully it won't be too long before it matures, gets a stout trunk and starts really growing upwards. Now I'm stepping back so you can see the full form of the next palm tree. This is Trachycarpus princeps hybrid, and this is grown pretty big. It's pushed out many leaves this year. Each leaf is bigger than the takil palm next to it, so it's a huge palm now. Big leaves, very vigorous grower. We'll get a closer look in a second, but that is it compared to the takil next to it. So big leaves, like I said, 6 or 7 leaves grown this year, and we'll just walk closer to it so we can see the trunk. And it has flowered again this year, and you can see the very distinctive orange fluffy tomentum on the trunk there. So that's very distinctive, very bright, rusty gingery orange, and it's got a decent sized thick trunk all the way down to the ground there. I've cut off quite a few of the lower leaves so you can see the trunk. It's a beautiful palm tree. And next to the princeps hybrid we had the one that we planted out originally as manipurensis or ensis, but now thought to be probably naintal. and that's grown pretty well. It's not quite as big as the princeps hybrid, but it's not too far off. It flowered again this year. It's got a nice trunk, very similar to the princeps hybrid, but not quite as wide, but pretty close. Leaves are very similar as well, but not as big, not as quick growing. So you can see that side by side. So they've got the princeps hybrid there, huge leaves, and then obscured by the foliage, you've got the thought to be manipur, but is in fact naintal behind. Side by side you can see they've grown well, and that's a fake manipur. Now let's have a look at the real ensis. Next we have Trachycarpus naintal. It's grown pretty well. Looks pretty much like a standard Trachycarpus fortunei, but it should grow bigger, and it does grow quicker, because we'll compare that with a fortunei, which is just over there. You can see both in shot, and it's grown larger, and they're both planted at roughly the same sort of size, so it has grown quicker and larger than fortunei. Nice green leaves, nowhere near as big as the princeps hybrid, but still a good palm, very hardy. Nice trunk on there as well, sort of darker trunk, and that is a good grower, good palm for UK gardens. Next we have the true Trachycarpus princeps palm, and this, remember, when it was planted was a very small palm, like a lot of the others here, and it's a slow growing palm until it gets going, so it's nowhere near as big as palms either side of it. So just let that leaf from the neighbouring palm go over it, and we'll go down and look at the princeps in closer detail. You can see it's got those whitish, bluish underside of leaves. We've got the fresh gingery tomentonum down there, and it's grown about 3 leaves this year, so pretty slow this year, but it's got that beautiful leaf form and colour. The top of the leaves have edged in bluish white as well. But like I said, a pretty slow growing palm. If we look carefully at the centre, as well as the tomentonum, we've got the ligules on the leaf bases, on the petioles, on the trunk, and you can see their sort of darkish colour. I'll just zoom in so you can see that a bit better. You've also got some other debris around that, but you can see the dark colour and the tomentum around there as well. Next we've got the classic palm tree, Trachycarpus fortunei. This is the ubiquitous palm tree that you find everywhere across the UK where people have planted true palm trees. So you might see the cordyline or torbay palm, which isn't a true palm, planted everywhere, and then this is the other plant that you see, and that's the fortunei, and it's grown well. It's a good doer in the garden. The leaves have held out well, they've not been ragged about by the wind too much, but it is a bit more floppy leaved compared to the wagnerianus, and it's grown again about 5-6 leaves this year. The trunk itself is quite a darkish colour on this one. You can see the dead leaves, or the lower leaves, dying off down there, the trunk behind, and this has grown, like I said, it's the fence line's 2 meters, so it's not got to 2 meters yet. Top of the leaves are just about there, but the trunk's nowhere near there yet. These haven't grown super fast because obviously they're competing against each other, and they're competing against the conifer hedge behind, which does slow down growth of plants somewhat. Down here we have the smallest and slowest growing Trachycarpus, that's Trachycarpus geminisectus. It's still no bigger than this time last year, and in fact the new leaves are a bit more stunted this year, so you can see this one's smaller than normal, although it's trying to push out a couple of leaves. It's only grown, I think, 1.5 leaves this year, so hardly any growth on this whatsoever. And it's hard to show you much more of this particular one. It's got a very dark trunk down there, you can see that there, and it's reasonably well attached to the ground, so hopefully this one's not suffering from basal canker or anything like that, because it's been in the ground for so long now. This is how big it is after all these years. Still no bigger than my foot really, so it's a very, very small palm indeed. Next we have a very sorry looking Trachycarpus latisectus. The dark leaves here showing that have some damage from the cold, the -6 we've had, but probably pretty much defoliate this winter. And it's grown 3 large leaves this year, pretty much defoliated last year. And if we go down and we look at the trunk, we can see, if we move all this foliage out of the way, we've got a nice tapering trunk, and that's about 40 centimeters tall, something like that. But like I said, it's lost its leaves last year, it's probably going to lose its leaves this year. It's not had a good run of form over the last 2 years. Hopefully we'll get a string of milder winters and this can romp away and start getting taller and taller. Compared to the neighbouring fortunei, it's probably less than half the size of that. And next we have the very small diminutive Trachycarpus nanus, true nanus, and the leaves are getting a bit bigger, a bit longer, but it's still a very small palm. So it's grown 1, nearly 2 leaves. You can see the second one just opening there. This is a palm that really doesn't grow much of a trunk. Mostly it's an underground trunk. Occasionally it does grow above ground, but not by a great deal. There's no trunk really to show you. And that is the growth after all these years. Had this over 10 years from a 1-leaf seedling, and it's no bigger than my foot, like the geminisectus. It's a very, very slow growing palm tree. Here we have Trachycarpus NOVA, which is about 2.5 meters, maybe 3 meters tall nearly now. Nice big leaves like fortunei, like princeps hybrid, drooping leaflets. Again, that's pushed out 4 or 5 big leaves this year. And if we get closer and look at that trunk, we can see it's a very robust, thick trunk. It's flowered again this year. Not really too much momentum at the top, but it's a nice, strong growing palm for the garden. So that's Trachycarpus NOVA. And here, in a sea of bamboo seedlings that I did promise I would dig up this year, and it looks like it's going to be next year before I dig them up, we have the Trachycarpus oreophilus with its very tall, slender trunk. And this is well over 3 meters tall now. The trunk's well over 2 meters. And then we've got the leaves above, which have just been hit by -6, so they're a bit tatty on the edges there, but the central leaves are doing just fine. The rarest Trachycarpus you can find. A good grower, and can't be long until we see this flowering. It's still not flowered yet, but it can't be long until it does, because that trunk, you know, it's big and mature now, very tightly woven fibers on it, and beautiful fan leaves above, nice sort of apple green coloured. Pretty much no, well, hardly any tomentum on there. It's very different from some of the other Trachycarpus palm trees. One of my favourite palms in the garden, one of the rarest as well. Absolutely gorgeous palm tree, very tropical looking for Trachycarpus. And that's what it looks like at the end of the growing season in 2023. Here's Trachycarpus kumaon. Beautiful, healthy green leaves, pretty much circular as well. And that's a good, strong grower. That's grown again 4 or 5 leaves this year. All of them are still looking in really, really good conditions. That holds the health of the leaves for a very long time. Very nice shade of green on here. Go down to see the trunk, which has been put on some height. You can see that there. Very similar to fortunei. Quite narrow, this trunk, but it's still not got too much height to it. So it's about 50 centimeters or so of trunk, and then you've got the leaves going above. And this is about Actually, by the top of the leaves, you are approaching 2 meters tall now. So it has put on some decent growth this year. And a very, very healthy looking palm tree indeed. And here we have my remaining ensis. For all the previous videos, we've had the other ensis, which was much bigger in the back garden. This is the same age, but was grown from a tiny seedling, so it's much, much smaller. You can see how it's crept along the ground, started on the right, and it's moved towards the left. And at this age, it looks very, very similar to takil. Long ligules, long petioles, should I say. Similar leaves as well, so very similar to the takil. And very, very slow growing as well. So we'll wait for this to bulk up. It is underneath a Phoenix wagnerianus palm. The thinking behind that was that Phoenix will eventually die and this palm can take over. So this is a replacement Trachycarpus ensis. It's been in the ground just as long, pretty much. I'll put the data when it's planted on the screen. You can see how slowly it's grown in that time. So this is a new one that we're looking in future videos, yearly updates. We'll be looking at this ensis rather than the one that died after being transferred a few years ago in the back garden, slowly dwindled away, and I dug it up earlier in the year. So that is Trachycarpus ensis.